Do you think in Ireland we've taken sovereignty for granted?
For a state to declare sovereignty, it must be in a position to uphold that sovereignty.
What do you see as the biggest threats to Ireland right now?
Real actors are those involved in disinformation, who really know what they're putting out there is absolutely incorrect and designed to shape opinions. We've had the near misses with the cyber attack on HSE.
Yeah.
I mean, that should have been really a wake-up call in terms of vulnerability. Strategic autonomy requires capabilities that the EU does not have. And secondly, strategic autonomy requires a culture. Culture does not change overnight.
Other customers around the world, give me AI because I need it now. Because the mission is more important than the regulation.
But down the road, if you like, of an unregulated AI world, we're really in a dangerous space. We roll back and look at what happened with social media, where it was unregulated largely. Yeah. And the price we're paying for that today in what I call the inversion of power.
How should we respond?
Russia to become stronger, all that has to happen is Europe to become weaker. The stakes are very, very high if we don't succeed.
Today we're joined by a truly distinguished guest, Vice Admiral Mark Mellett. Welcome, Mark.
John, listen, it's great to join you here.
Thank you. And he's a former Chief of Staff of the Irish Defence Forces, a strategic leader, renowned advocate for national and European security. Mark has led transformative change in Ireland's defence forces, contributed on the global stage in the UN and NATO missions, and remains a thought leader in defence innovation, leadership and collaborative security. So to start off, how would you define sovereignty in the European context today? And especially when we talk about European integration, individual nation states, and we'll probably talk about how Ireland fits into that as well as a starting point.
Yeah. I think, there's obviously a technical description for sovereignty, but it is an institution of evolution. And if we look back in the last 100 years, sovereignty meant a lot more in terms of its unilateral value to a state. But in a globalized world, it's a much more challenging concept to have, I suppose, certainty with. To simple points, I wrote about this, I think in my PhD, was, sovereignty is very much like property, and sovereign rights are very much like property rights. I always say sovereign rights that are not upheld are more imaginary than real. So for a state to declare sovereignty, it must be in a position to uphold that sovereignty. And upholding that sovereignty is similar to your home in terms you have a fence, you have a security system, you invest in your insurance. And the same with sovereignty. If you don't do those things, your sovereignty is vulnerable and you move into a condition known as open access. Others can come in and interfere with your flower bed, they can come into your home, they can steal your wife's jewellery, they can do all those nasty things and you can't do very much about it. So it is about an understanding in terms of an entitlement, but it's also crafted within international law. There's also then a question around sovereignty which goes to obligations. Yeah. You can't just sit in a silo and say, I'm sovereign, and then be benign or invisible to your neighbours. There is an interdependency, because if your territory or your jurisdiction is used not for a malign act against you, but against your neighbour, then you're not actually being sovereign in the true sense. You need to ensure that you're not doing bad things to your neighbours. So that's where the globalisation piece comes in.
Yeah. And do you think in Ireland we've taken sovereignty for granted?
I think so, yeah. I think I've said it and I'm not going to not say it again. I'll repeat it. We've been free-riding for many decades. And the reality is, but a lot of European states have been in that position. We've had an extraordinary period of 80 years since the Second World War, a sense, I suppose, in terms of peace and security, built on the likes of Robert Schuman. But it wasn't just that. It was also the aftermath of the Second World War, the investment through the Marshall Plan, $15 billion to rebuild, let's say, some of the states that were crushed, the interest of the US throughout all of those decades in Europe. And yes, we've had mishaps, the Balkan Wars, but it still was quite an extraordinary period of peace that would lead you into a sense of security that actually wasn't really meriting with the facts. That's changed very much so. It started changing in 2008 in terms of the Russian Federation invasion of Georgia, and that creeping annexation still goes on. It was obviously exemplified in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and now we see it with the actual completely illegal unforgivable invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And all the activities that go on the margins in terms of hybrid activity, cyber activity, the HSE attack in terms of a health services driven by an institution that was land-based in the Russian Federation. Absolutely unforgivable in the context of what is happening today. So the gloves are off. We're in a very, very challenging world today, and Ireland has obligations now to ensure it does its part.
And do you see, geography being a big part of that historically? And, the further away we are from Russia, the more we can take sovereignty for granted. Whereas if you are in Eastern Europe, they're the people who spend most on defence in Europe.
Yeah, and I remember I sat on the military committee in Brussels for 6 years, and I often had those discussions with my fellow chiefs of defence. And I remember Stuart Peach, who was a former chairman of the NATO committee, and prior to that he was CDS Chief of Defence Staff in the UK. And we used to discuss the issue of that straddling that the Russian Federation is quite capable of.
Yeah.
That's the ability, obviously, to have activity on the Eastern Front, but just in a matter of days to mass a task force on the west coast of Ireland.
Yeah.
And guess what happened? On the very days leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, what happened? The Russian Federation said we're going to have an exercise in Ireland's jurisdiction for 5 days, where we are going to actually ask Irish actors to stay out of our own economic zone while they carry out artillery and missile exercises. It's unconscionable. And that really was a play in terms of the vulnerability of Ireland. We're no longer an island behind an island, a sentinel in the Atlantic. We're absolutely locked into Europe, not just through sea lines of communications, but through sea lines of undersea communications, the fibre optic cables, the interconnectors and energy. There is a whole trade as well that goes with that, and we might come on to that in terms of the shadow fleets and what's happening in that whole world.
Yeah, and just to extend that, what do you see as the biggest threats to Ireland right now? Obviously, sovereignty, in your view, can't be taken for granted, but what are the threats to that sovereignty?
I think the biggest threat is hybrid. I think it's a manipulation in terms of public opinion. We see it in right-wing, we see it in terms of racism, we see it in xenophobia, we're seeing it in terms of the cyber world. We're seeing it in terms of a whole attempt by many forces just to destabilize. I keep on saying, for Russia to become stronger, all that has to happen is Europe to become weaker. And that can be state by state. It can start by the fracturing of the multilateral framework of the EU. It can start by driving a wedge between UK and Ireland. It can start by actually destabilizing populations internally in terms of fanning the flames of xenophobia, of racism, and we're seeing a lot of that right now.
Right.
And that's the threat. That's the threat to civil society in terms of the actual man-made side. There is a secondary one which is much bigger, and that's the whole issue of climate and the penalty that would come with that. And it's a separate discussion, and we can get on to that because
absolutely.
I'm quite challenged with that as well.
And then if you look at that destabilization in those information operations you're talking about, has that been going on for a while and very deliberate across Europe?
Yeah, I don't think we really have I don't think we have that kind of key date when we all woke up and said, you know what, there's been an inversion of power.
Yeah.
I certainly, in my time as Chief of Staff, I think that was arising in that kind of 10 years between kind of 2012 to 2021, 22, we were going through an inversion of power where, individuals were able to be weaponized in a manner that they could come together like a pack and run and actually go after, targets unknowns to themselves, often just being manipulated. And there's two sides to it. There's disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
Huge amount of the cohort, the constituency, are just responding to misinformation, naive, innocent, perhaps not really knowing what they're doing, but going with the flow, but at the same time building that critical mass.
Yeah.
The real actors are those involved in disinformation, who really know what they're putting out there is absolutely incorrect and designed to shape opinions. And that's what it's doing. It's shaping opinions in the ballot box. It's interfering with actually democratic processes.
Yeah.
It's actually really challenging a lot of the institutions and the values we hold, all being targeted. And a lot of that is state-led, and a huge amount of it is Russian Federation sponsored.
Interesting. And And in terms of those threats emerging, have you seen the culture across Europe around defence, the attitude politically towards defence? You know, historically we've had low priorities placed through various governments on defence spending. You know, we can touch on why that is a little later, but in terms of the recognition of defence as a major sovereign issue now, do you see that having changed dramatically in the
It
last
has
couple of years?
changed dramatically, but I think it's been taking a lot of wake-up calls. You know,
Yeah.
I often say there are three ways you'll get a real institutional change. One is actually a shock, a catastrophic shock where something happens.
Yeah.
The second is a near miss. Sometimes that will do. You'll get you just to the decision point. You know, we don't want that to happen. And the third is, you know, a legislative driver whereby there's actually an international requirement for you to do something.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of the former two, the shock, we saw that with Ukraine. You know, but in Ireland we've had the near misses with the cyber attack on HSE.
Yeah.
I mean, that should have been really a wake up call in terms of vulnerability. But come back then a little bit further in terms of the institutions and that, I think there has been that kind of tension within Europe for decades. You know, it was an economic powerhouse, a diplomatic powerhouse. It wasn't a military alliance, and it was very careful to actually stay out of that space. And there were actors very strong on that who would be advocates for NATO in particular. They didn't want replication or duplication of what NATO was capable of.
Sure.
And they would have even resisted the complementarity of developing institutions within the EU that could complement NATO in terms of its capabilities. But I think, I suppose, the first clear, call out I saw, and you know, just to some degree, it was kind of poo-pooed, was the actual French call for strategic autonomy. Initially, in around 2016, they started arguing this point, but they were really right. And, you know, whereas initially strategic autonomy was couched around defence and security, it's now moved into other areas like supply chain.
Yeah.
And I say you cannot have strategic autonomy without self-sustainability on energy, for instance.
Sure.
So the whole need for Europe to actually have that ability to actually stand up for itself has moved. But there are two caveats. Strategic autonomy requires capabilities that the EU does not have. And secondly, strategic autonomy requires a culture. A culture does not change overnight. It can take years. It can take decades. In fact, I often say about, you know, somebody said culture eats strategy for breakfast. No, it devours everything in front of it. So when you're taking on a culture that you need to change, you really need to be measured. You need to actually look at your timeline, and you need to go on a really strategic approach to change that mindset. And I see that now required domestically here in Ireland, because that mindset needs to change. We're in such a vulnerable position in this state.
And talk to me about what you mean by strategic autonomy. Define that.
I would see that there is the capacity to collaborate with others where possible, but to act unilaterally where necessary. Simple as that.
Right.
So I'm not saying that we go off and say, oh, we have to replicate everything NATO has. No, actually, the way to do it is to build that relationship with NATO so there are no gaps, no seams that can be exploited by the likes of the Russian Federation or others. And similarly, you have to come to a détente with US in terms of what that relationship is like. Where are the dependencies? Where can we rely on each other? Where is the reciprocity between us? And then you go along and you look at where are strategic gaps that we need to actually ensure that we have a hedge on that, if all comes to all, that we can call on that.
So in a way, we all know French government and French companies like to buy French products.
Yeah.
So they've achieved a lot of strategic autonomy through that, haven't they?
They have, yeah. And I think it frustrates me a little bit, and I'll be critical of the French on this. You know, it's do as I say, not as I do. And I often think France could do a little bit more about being a little bit more collaborative. And I'm saying that as a member, a commander of the Legion d'Honneur, and I really appreciate Macron's government making that award. But nevertheless, we are all in this together. And this is about a symphony, about a harmony between us. It's not about trying to be the conductor. We need to work together to create that strength and that unity with the members of the EU and our nearest neighbours like the UK and Norway, and likewise in terms of strengthening that bilateral in terms of transatlantic with US, Canada and others.
And do you see that strategic autonomy happening on a cross-European basis then, not just having, you know, a French defence industry, a German defence industry, a UK? Are they collaborating together?
In fairness, that's what PESCO and that's what is attempted. That's the vision in terms of the European Defence Agency, is to try and get away from dozens of similar platforms trying to replicate the same capability, but actually, none really having the strategic capacity to do so. Why not pool those together? And the US is good at this. The US doesn't have dozens of, it has a couple of standard platforms to deliver particular types of capability, and that's the way they do it. And they're organized around that. We need to do the same in Europe.
Interesting. And the momentum is there to do that now, do you think? Or is the culture in the way still?
Culture is in the way. Of course, culture is in the way. Yeah. There's loads of vested interests who, basically, oh Lord, make me pure, but not just quite yet. So I think there's a piece there with regards to bringing, and holding feet to the fire and making sure that we get that shift. And, the stakes are very, very high if we don't succeed.
Fascinating. And if you think then about that industry initiatives around defence, and you think then about innovation, right? Like, you were known for being an innovator in the Irish Navy. What specific innovations do you think make a big impact on this, reimagining of defence and sovereignty? What are you interested in from the innovation side?
Yeah, I think there's a new rule book being written. I think anybody who's in the AI space and the tech space, wow, it's such an exciting time.
Yeah.
Like, we're moving at a pace that every second new technologies, new ways of doing things are being created.
Yeah.
We need to have that kind of really growth mindset, that open mindset in terms of what's happening. I used to say that in my last job and when I was Chief of Navy, I used to say, everybody should ask himself or herself a question every morning. What's new in what I do today that will actually cause me to go about it in a different manner? And if there is nothing new there, you continue to do it the way it was. But you have with open source, in terms of open access to so much information, we really need to keep our antenna up there so that we're ensuring that the technologies that are coming so fast and so quickly onto stream, we're in touch with those. And this is bigger than just the individual. This brings you into the whole issue of networks.
Yeah.
And, I always argue, in terms of the kind of three types of innovation. There's closed innovation where, a team like us here try and innovate, within a silo. And in the past, I remember making this point in the Navy, and I was talking about the need for innovation. And somebody pushed back at me and said, we've always been innovating. And, I was knocked back, it was a town hall, and I said, he's right, actually. What's the difference? And then it came to me. Yeah, we're innovating within the walled garden of the Navy. We need to have open innovation where we're innovating with others. We need to create those networks whereby we go and see how business is done in other areas. I remember one of the first things I did, and I remember, being scoffed at actually with the idea of it, going down to the central bank shortly after I became Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces and bringing the General Staff with me. And I could hear the grumblings, what the feck are we going down here for?
Yeah.
And we met the governor and his team. And I just remember, we said, we just want to have a discussion about issues. And within 5 minutes, we were on the same page.
Yeah.
And I remember the governor making the point, we are in the business of economic security. And, we wish we read the signs leading to the 2008 crash, with greater fidelity. We didn't. And we learned a lesson from that. And we were in the same business.
Yeah.
We're in the business of defence and looking at signs and looking at data and indicators as to how things are going. And then we had a real fruitful conversation with regards to two institutions completely poles apart in business, actually in the same business. So that's just an example. So I say to people, always learn the language of others. I don't mean literally, but I mean get into other areas where you're uncomfortable with, whether it be technology, whether it be, pharma, whether it be agriculture, just get in. You'll always find something there that actually you can bring back as a nugget to your own business.
That's really interesting. That's, you know, I come from a financial services background, so it was all about risk.
Yeah,
Risk management.
exactly.
I was in Lehman Brothers and they went bankrupt, went badly wrong. And a lot of the conversations on the defense side are about, you know, nation risk. They're
Yeah.
a different level of risk,
Yeah.
you know, and it's a much more important mission, if you like.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting when you getting those two teams together. So that's a great way to foster collaboration.
And there was a third, I covered kind of closed and open, but, you know, disruptive innovation comes when you bring in that, kind of external, that kind of left field actor who nobody feels has anything to contribute.
Yeah.
And actually, that's where you get the disruption then. And that's the reason I would have been such a champion on gender equality and diversity inclusion, because, you know, I always felt there were communities, you know, within the defence forces in many ways who were gagged, who were not given an opportunity to actually express points of view.
Yeah.
And I remember once it was with Barry O'Sullivan, I think in Insight in UCC,
Yeah.
and we were doing a workshop around, you know, just innovation, and somebody asked the question, had we ever tried dynamic scheduling for our patrols? And I said, dynamic scheduling, yeah, dynamic scheduling. I've been in the Navy for 30 years. I knew the front end of a ship, I knew the back end, I knew the engine room, I knew the bridge, I knew the power. Each engine had 1,200 horsepower. I knew everything about the Navy. And here was this person asking me how I should patrol with the ship.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, taking all the data you have for the last 30 years and, you know, analysing it and deciding where's the best place to go, you know, to actually have the most effect. And there was a eureka moment, and we started doing that then, you know, going back, looking at, let's say, you know, around this time of year, earlier, let's say May, I remember going to points where there was nothing, you know, showing on sightings or radars or anything about a particular fishing activity because there was a megrim spawning in this area.
Yeah.
And I remember going blind there. We had no indication except that the data told us fishers go after undersized megrim in this area this time of year. And guess what? There they were, fishing for undersized megrim at this time of year. And we got 2 arrests that day. That person, you know, first of all, was not in the Navy.
Yeah.
Secondly, that person was a woman. And for me, then it drew me back. Here we had somebody with an external perspective, you know, showing us that if we have too much male groupthink, at that time we had 93% males in the organization, we were to some degree just, you know, playing the same game all the time, whereas we needed to be disruptive.
Yeah.
And that's the piece you need for disruptive innovation.
Interesting. And is there a risk then of people working in defence getting overwhelmed by people coming in at them with so much defence?
Of course,
or so much innovation?
Yeah, and I've got beaten up over that, you know, because I remember people saying you can't be encouraging dissent, you know, but at the same time, if you want to get that external view, you know, you have to, or that even internal view, which is contrarian, you have to give it without fear or favour. And you can't have a hostile, you know, retort if somebody gives you an idea that may not be fit for purpose. You have to have a mechanism whereby you can take it in, absorb it, and say, great point, but not this time around.
Yeah.
This is where we're going to go. At the end of the day, the commander has to make the decision, whether it's up the middle with smoke or left or right flank. She or he is responsible in terms of those decisions. But you have to try and create a mechanism whereby you're taking as much information pieces in as quickly as possible to come to that point of truth. One thing I always say is a standard rule in any organization: never throw the innovator under the bus. And I've seen it so many times where somebody, for good reason, tries to do something new, you know, and it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And the system default is to isolate them, almost, you know, put them in a corner or drive the bus over them. And I used to feel myself, I spent a lot of time under the bus as Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces because I would have been pushing back with the Department of Defence on matters. I can talk a little bit more freely about it now. And so be it. It goes with the cut and trust of being a leader, of being a Chief Executive. And it can be a lonely place. You know, there isn't the kind of, I almost said there is a need for a kind of Innovators Anonymous, you know, just to actually give you that sounding board to keep your, I suppose, tempo going, not to actually, you know, to resort back to business as usual. because that's the comfortable place, but it's not the place that gets you over to your objective.
And have we struck the right balance in Europe now that we're actually open to innovation, or is it just the need is driving innovation?
I think there is still a challenge in terms of getting the institutions to change in the right way, bringing the culture along. I think we still have, in not just in Europe in general, but in Ireland also, we have a tradition of silos. We're very comfortable with silos.
Yeah.
You know, if I had a penny for every time somebody senior and official would say to me, "Oh, those guys are going to eat your lunch," you know, and I was saying, this is national interest stuff.
Okay.
This is good for us all. But no, like, you know, from the point of view of...
So it's envy within the organization.
Precisely. Envy within the organizations, envy between organizations, individuals trying to hold on to power, knowing that actually if they, you know, were to cede power, they mightn't get the reflection they would get in their immediate community. I have another simple principle I always say: you must cede power to gain power. That's the reality in a globalized world. No individual has all the answers in their immediate circle. But there is a good chance in their broader circle, somebody might have been through a particular experience that if you have that network connected, they can be really helpful for you. So that's the point. And that goes back to the network piece.
Yeah.
Nurture those networks. Actually, you know, treat them like, you know, a fertile ground. Maintain those contacts, even where they're diverse and, you know, in other jurisdictions, keep on those communications going. That's the way you actually find that nugget that might be the critical piece to the challenge you're dealing with on a particular day.
And would you worry about strategic autonomy around AI, where the US and China are investing so much in data and chips and models? Do we become a consumer of somebody else's technology, or will we achieve strategic autonomy in a key innovation space for the next
It's a
50
wicked
years?
problem. This is a wicked problem in terms of if we roll back and look at what happened with social media, where it was unregulated largely, and the price we're paying for that today in what I call the inversion of power, the actual pressure, and so many of society were absolutely addicted to social media, which drives ahead. And you have main platforms saying, "Oh, we're regulating all the rest." They're interested in the bottom line in terms of profit. So you can take it as light regulation, internal. It's soft law. It's not working to the speed it is, and there's a huge challenge, I think, in society as a consequence. If we go down the road, if you like, of an unregulated AI world, we're really in a dangerous space. There has to be some kind of a structures, and this is, we've heard it all before. The US innovates, Europe regulates, China replicates. Well, I'm not too sure that's the way it is anymore, but somebody has to be an adult. And I think in the context of AI, there is a need for some kind of a framework to ensure that there are principles and norms there. And I know the European AI Act is there. It may have been put on ice for a short period, but that kind of thinking is required.
Do you think that regulate first, build second, though, puts a dampener on industry, or not even industry, but the consumers of technology? And I've experience of European institutions saying, we're not going to use AI yet because we've to see how the AI Act behaves. Other customers around the world, give me AI because I need it now, because the mission is more important than the regulation.
Yeah, I think there are principles that need to be agreed upon, that actually give us a sense of the values we're trying to protect as we move along as fast as we can with the development of AI. So I'm kind of hedging my bets on the answer here, because I'm not in the space, but I just know I've worked with Barry in Cork and VS in the Northwestern on this area, and it is a wicked problem, trying to manage that piece whereby you have a framework for building the plane, but actually you want to fly it at the same time, and that's where the space we're in. We're trying to build it and fly it simultaneously.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it feels like different jurisdictions are going at a different pace because of regulation as well. No, and if you think then about, go back to the hybrid threats, right? And all the different innovations that we hear about, that we're involved in it as well, whether it's satellite, whether it's, open source intelligence, whether it's, AI driven, sea drones, scanning the surface. There's so much more data in the maritime domain,
Yeah.
particularly, isn't there, than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Have you seen that evolve?
Well, that's the point. And it's data, on its own is as much use as a hole in the head. You actually have to actually be able to mine those data and get them through into valuable information that you convert into knowledge that informs your decisions. And that's the critical piece. But there is a values piece there also in terms of how you actually do that continuum.
Yeah.
If you have the mining of data and the creation of information and creation of knowledge, and then you apply that in the absence of values, you get often unilateralism, competition, you get almost selfishness.
Yeah.
Whereas if you do it within a framework of values, you're more likely to have wisdom, really strategic outcomes that actually will bring you the long journey rather than the short-term gain you will get it if you go it on your own.
Interesting. And in terms of the hybrid threats we're talking about, how does democratic society in Western Europe respond? How should we respond? What can we do?
Yeah, I think there is increasingly, and I was just talking to somebody about this morning, we need to have a much bigger understanding of defence and security as being a whole of society matter.
Right.
Finnish are good at this. Whereas traditionally in Ireland, for instance, defence has been siloed into a department, external, or not external, but separate to the rest of the actual key drivers of this state.
Yeah.
State security is inextricably linked with economic security, which is inextricably linked with energy security.
Yeah.
So when you bring those all together, defence and security has to be a cross-cutting theme that touches every part of society, every part of government and policy, every part of market and enterprise, and every part of citizen and civil society. They're critical in terms of if we, as let's say a state and as a nationhood, want to have defence and security, we all have a part to play.
Interesting. So it's a whole of society is really the solution here, rather than just siloed thinking.
Well, it's critical. Absolutely. Yeah. It is absolutely critical. And then, the construction of a framework for that. What does it look like?
Yeah.
It goes right up to the top, first of all, then in terms of the National Security Committee. What does that look like? And in terms of who's on it. And then it comes down to in terms of officials, in terms of how are they organised, in terms of the cross-cutting facilitation of inputs from all the diverse institutions of the state itself. And then it peppers down into the individual departments themselves in terms of how they have a congruence with regards to the information they feed up through their principle into the national architecture.
I met with a CEO of an Irish company recently who was saying that they had a government minister due to visit them, but then they found out that they were involved in defence and they cancelled it because they didn't want to have questions, questions in the Dáil about getting involved in the defence industry, and do you think we've matured past that now? Do you think that?
Well, I'm so sorry for that person whose head is in the sand, because we need leadership at all levels.
Yeah,
I keep on saying this, even at the political level, we need leadership. And this is not something that we can pussyfoot around anymore.
Right.
This is, something whereby we need to actually have the clear articulation of what's on the table here in terms of risks to society, to economics, to, I suppose, the lights on.
Yeah.
This is really, really treacherous waters we're in at present. And that leadership, is required politically, but it also is required in executives, in let's say, multinationals, in smaller companies.
Yeah.
Like I've been pushing and trying to drive an idea I have, around, let's say, a tapestry of some of those really, really smart companies. The Ubotica you had on recently, the Catex Oceans, the X Oceans, the Vrays, where we could actually have them all in a room together, pieces of a jigsaw, of a tapestry that would give us, Ireland, a really critical architecture for maritime domain awareness. and not just maritime domain awareness, this next step in terms of intervention to do something about it. And there may be strategic gaps then, and that's fine. But having the type of individuals who are leading those companies come together and do that, we could very quickly start solving one of our big deficits in our economic architecture is the lack of a defence and security industry in Ireland. We really need to actually grow up, cop on, look at where we are leading globally in many niche areas, and actually say, do you know what, let's pool this together and create a sovereign tool here. It'll cost a bit of money initially, but very quickly this will drive towards being an investment centre that ultimately will be a profit centre. One of the biggest frustrations I had in my last job is if I wanted to buy a Kevlar or a helmet, I had to go to Israel, and pay top dollar to the Israelis who made it, with in wherever they made it. We wanted to buy a weapon, we went to Austria. We want to buy an armoured car or a Pilatus aircraft, we went to Switzerland, where wages were 1.5 times they are here in Ireland. And we did, they were very happy to take our euro as we paid it to them and created employment and give security to families in those jurisdictions. But we were, we need to do something similar in Ireland. We need to actually look at dual use initially, where we have a very high level of ambition across a lot of the tech sector that could really be game changers in this. And because I said earlier on, the rule book has been torn up, now is the time to do it, where we actually strive to create this industry in Ireland, which is good, not just for the state. Clearly, it's good for the defence forces, but it's good then, if you like, regionally in terms of our part, in terms of PESCO and others. We corner that piece.
Yeah, and I think from a Siren perspective, we like to be the data fusion platform to
Fantastic.
be all that.
Great stuff. Okay, I should have brought you. Should have put you in the centre.
Absolutely, we'll put ourselves in the centre, no problem.
Yeah, and I can manage it for you.
Lovely. But I think what's really interesting about the vision you're painting there is all these companies have left Ireland, got their experience, got their customers outside of Ireland, and can bring home that knowledge and experience.
Well, precisely, and it's a pity, that they've had to leave Ireland. They had to knock on doors, often with very difficult institutional support, whether it be on security clearance, getting into areas whereby they're not part of NATO. They've really done a remarkable job in terms of the Everest they've climbed unilaterally. But imagine just bringing that together. The force on that would be extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the scale of the challenge we have and the amount of water in our economic jurisdiction, it's a big problem to address. So you need all these parts of technologies you're talking about.
Well, that's the point. And I just mentioned before I've just finished my first draft of my book, and it's Blue Heart is the name, but the ocean, nature's last frontier.
Yeah.
Our jurisdiction is huge for so many reasons. It is critical to our economy in terms of sea lines of communications, in terms of trade. 90% of our trade comes in by sea. Yeah. It's critical in terms of subsea fiber optic cables. It keeps our tech industry going. There's $10 trillion of business done a day by subsea cables.
Wow.
And it's critical to us in terms of food. At the moment, I have a challenge in terms of the way the common fishery policy is applied throughout European waters, and in particular in Irish jurisdictions. There are going to be hard questions with regards to bottom trawling into the future. We need to expedite the move towards 30% marine protected areas by 2030. And then we need to step back for a moment and just look at the ocean. The only reason we're having this conversation now is because of the ocean. It's absorbed 90% of the excess heat from climate change. It's absorbed 30% of the excess carbon, and it's becoming saturated. And we haven't got much more time, until, we're in really, really treacherous waters. But it is a reality. So climate change is coming in with the speed of a tomahawk. It is really, really something that is, and it's back to governance in terms of our maritime jurisdiction. So besides defence and security, we need control and enforcement in terms of how we bring in good governance in our jurisdiction. Yeah. Start protecting biodiversity as carbon sinks, ensuring that we actually expedite other ways of actually producing food, not just in terms of bottom trawling and chasing a diminishing stock level. New governance mechanisms whereby a marine protected area also becomes a spillover for sustainable local fisheries and start, let's say, generating back to days whereby there's added value. I mean, just over the road there, somebody should look at the story of the likes of Rossaville, a community-based fish processing plant that was starved of resources because the quotas were allocated to bigger operators, and no employment is now in Rossaville. It's effectively closed down.
Really?
Whereas you could have an added value local fishing community there who are bringing their resource in, adding value for national and international export. It's gone.
And obviously you're passionate about climate change.
I am.
Right? The US administration basically doesn't believe in climate change anymore. You also have in Asia, I spent a lot of time in Asia and the Middle East. They don't believe in climate change either. I don't think Africa, it's not the top three item. So is Europe getting isolated in terms of, advocacy around the things we need to do to prevent climate change or to moderate climate change? What do you see happening in a global context there?
I said it here first. We have no idea
Right.
how bad the impacts of climate change are going to be. They are going to be dystopian. That's a reality. That's what's coming down the track.
Yeah.
Let's deal with China for a moment, because we just touched on. We have an objective of 37 gigawatts by 2050 in terms of renewable energy.
Yeah.
What do you think China has produced in the last 2 years in terms of wind and solar? 1,600 gigawatts. Right. Half of it more or less wind, half of it solar. Now, a lot of that has been built on hydrocarbon and coal energy or all the rest. But their new energy profile is 93% renewable, 7% carbon.
Yeah.
They're moving in a direction. They've already passed their 2030 targets. So when we talk about, pointing the finger and saying, we're doomed, there's nothing to do with us, we have to actually cop on. We need leadership here, and we need to drive ahead. Yeah. And we shouldn't be sweet talked into because the US is doing this or doing that. It's good for us. Back to Europe. Europe has always led on climate change. I am frustrated where I do see some regression on that, but it will wake up. What's happening as we speak.
Yeah.
In Portugal and Spain, they're on fire. I'm worried in terms of the capacity of the system to regenerate. Every year there is a center in Hawaii where the Keeling curve is maintained.
Yeah.
And it's after Dr. Keeling, who started it the same year I was born. And when he started measuring carbon in 1958, there were 313 parts per million. Today, there are 430 parts per million. I think by the time we're going to get to so-called net zero, we'll be at around 500 parts per million.
Yeah.
And 500 parts per million is over 3 degrees. So that's not the end state. That's up there.
Sure.
We need to pull it all the way back down to 313 parts or thereabouts if we've any hope of recovery. So it's not just about stopping emitting carbon. It's actually about getting rid of carbon that is already in the atmosphere. And as I said to you already, ocean is actually becoming full as a sink. It's becoming acidic. Yeah. It's interfering with actual biomass in the ocean. It's melting coral reefs. It's a worrying future ahead. So we can go along and we say we're happy days now.
Yeah.
But actually, every time I look at children, that's the eyes of the future looking back at us. And what are they going to say? Dad, what did you do, when you are told about the facts of climate change? You can't go along with a lie and say, oh, well, America wasn't doing anything, so we chose not to do it either.
Fair point. And if you look then at the next 5 to 10 years and the security situation in Europe, what do you see, if you're looking in your crystal ball, particularly looking at what happened in Washington over the last couple of days, where you see a lot of, what they call the coalition of the willing coming together with the US to try and solve for the Ukraine crisis. Give us your perspective of what does the future hold?
I think there's a political piece and there's a capability piece.
Yeah.
I think the capability piece is around the backstop and how that's created in terms of enough force to actually make it difficult when there is a peace settlement, and there will be, that there isn't going to be silly games because that's real risk for any boots on the ground there. And what worries me to some degree is, the narrative around US will not have boots on the ground, so therefore it's up to the Europeans to do it there.
Yeah.
And US may provide air cover. It's really, really difficult position to be in. There's a question with regards to reliability. I do not trust the Russian Federation. I will not trust the Russian Federation. So whatever comes out of this, it is absolutely critical that there are mechanisms in place to provide a required force protection for any forces that go in there on a peacekeeping mission.
Yeah.
The challenge in terms of UN mandate also comes into question. Where is a UN mandate in the context of a dysfunctional Security Council, whereby one of the P5 is actually the aggressor in this case? And then there's back to the political certainty that, what is agreed today will be held to in terms of a loyal undertaking in the future. So there is a very, very difficult time ahead on that.
Because you've got fabulous experience with the UN, working with NATO, time in the Lebanon, time in Afghanistan. You've seen these complicated situations in the past. So where's Ukraine on the scale of complexity and difficulty of solving this problem?
Well, it's about, I would say Ukraine is as difficult as Afghanistan.
Right.
In terms of the challenges that are there. And it's not because the actual, I suppose the force, threatening you is coming from within. It's going to be a hybrid. It's going to be little green men picking off on the edges,
right?
And with deniability. That's the type of environment that could rest there, and unless the matter is properly captured in a codified agreement that is, I suppose, capable of being monitored to the nth degree.
Yeah, and do you think then the talk about an Article 5 like guarantee, what does that mean in your view?
Well, there's a question mark over Article 5 as it stands.
Okay.
That's the reality. I think there have been some.
What's that question mark about?
The question mark is whether one of the NATO members is actually going to be loyal to an Article 5 requirement.
Right.
If there is an attack in Europe.
Do you think that's a real discussion that people are...
Well, it is, of course. I've been there. I've heard it. It is discussion. And that goes back to strategic autonomy, why Europe needs to actually move in a direction where it acquires its own capabilities. And there's a kind of a two-way street on that. I think the more we acquire capabilities and the more we're cheek by jowl with NATO, the more we strengthen Article 5 probability of being there. But if let's say we're fast and loose in terms of our own institutions, I think, certainly there is a question mark over Article 5 being a certainty into the future.
Right. So it's almost like back to the Sun Tzu and the art of war. The war you don't have to fight is the best war.
Well, listen, that was my job in Afghanistan, by the way. It was information operations, and it was about the non-lethal fires. The best way to win a war is actually not to fire a shot. And that's about creating effects of reassurance. Reassurance is the critical piece on this. But also you can create effects on deterrence, whereby the might that you can actually set and put there on the front is such that at their peril would somebody challenge that. And then there is also the question of legitimacy or perceived legitimacy. And it is critical that, whatever is captured is seen as being a legitimate outcome in terms of the agreement that is actually going to guarantee the security going forward.
I've seen articles where people are talking about nuclear proliferation within Europe, that other countries now want to become nuclear powers that weren't in the past because of the deterrence effect of that. Do you see that as credible?
I don't. There's a real challenge with nuclear, and it's not something I know that there is challenges in terms of those states within the European Union who have nuclear, who has got autonomy and who has not.
Yeah.
That's a discussion at present. But I think, in terms of if we're in the space whereby we're going to actually have to underwrite our sovereignty against a nuclear deterrent, I think all bets are off.
Yeah. Interesting. And in terms of prioritization for Europe, if you just one priority, what would you sum that up as for the future in defence?
I think it has to be the maritime space. I think
Okay.
there's such an interdependency there. European Union is an economic bloc. It relies on sea lines of communications in terms of trades, in terms of imports and exports. It relies on the sea lines of communications in terms of undersea cables. It will more and more into the future rely on sea lines for actual interconnectors in energy,
Yeah.
whether it be gas, whether it be electrical. It will rely on the sea lines of communications in terms of food and all that goes with that. And the real challenge, I think, for us all is how we're securing the maritime domain. Back to Grotius, who famously argued for mare liberum, the freedom of the seas.
Yeah.
That was great then, but it's different now. Grotius also said there would never be an occasion whereby there wouldn't be enough fish in the sea.
Okay.
And
Who's an optimist?
Absolutely. So mare clausum is a reality, certainly out to economic zones in terms of states, putting architecture in there, accepting that it is a shared international space.
Yeah.
So therefore your bilaterals with your immediate neighbours become critical, and then multilateral frameworks like they'll actually call the the International Maritime Organization and others, ensuring those institutions are properly working.
Yeah.
A huge challenge coming down the tracks within International Seabed Authority and deep sea mining, and what will that bring in terms of a rush to get access to resources beyond national jurisdiction. That's a worrying thing. We've really screwed up on the fisheries side. I'm certain we'll leave doing an even better job in terms of deep sea mining unless we get our act together.
And if you were advising a young leader going into defence, going into security industry, what advice would you give them, given what you...
Wonderful opportunity. I mean, listen, it is such... I look at a tapestry of careers, everyone different. One day you're a gunnery officer, on one of the newest ships being built in the state, Elietna, and that's one of my exciting times. Next time you're on the end of a line diving on a ship that's been blown up by the IRA in Lochfoyle, the St. Beaton, trying to clear explosives out of a hole. Next time you're in New York at an operation shop window for Ireland. First time an Irish naval ship has ever been into New York. Next time you're bringing a ship into Derry. The first time an Irish ship was ever in Derry as captain, and being met by Mark Durkin, who took the first line as we came alongside Queen's Quay in Derry. You could be serving in Afghanistan, you could be serving in Lebanon, or you can be serving at home in terms of, developing youngsters in one of the most exciting careers open to any woman or man in this state.
And what were the key leadership lessons you learned in that illustrious career with the Defence Forces?
I suppose learning from Mary Parker Follett, who said leadership is not so much about the exercise of power, but about the capacity to create that sense of power in those who are led. The real role of a leader is to create more leaders. And that's the interdependency that is about leadership. The day the leader thinks it's all about her or him is the day they're no longer a leader. It's absolutely about the women and men that are actually within your command that you can bring forward in terms of making things better.
Yeah, that's why I always like employing people who have been in services. They really have been trained in leadership. A lot of industry, we see people kind of learn leadership as they go and make mistakes. But what I've seen, I don't know if you'd agree with this, is you've a very structured building program to train leadership, don't you?
Absolutely, and I'm not a real advocate of the idea of leadership and followers. Everybody is a leader. I often used to say, a private on a checkpoint, as in Lebanon, he's a leader. He's making decisions in terms of how secure the area he has responsibility is on the basis of the car he stops and the boot he opens and what he looks inside.
Yeah.
Similarly, coxswain of a rib going to board, a drug smuggler. He's not going to go over the side and arrest the druggies, but if he doesn't do his job right, there will be no operation if he doesn't maneuver. So everybody, at the end of the day, as part of that kind of interconnectivity, is part of the leadership process.
Mark, one last question. if you could have any technology, whether it exists or not, what would be your one technology ask for people in the defense world?
I think they need a co-pilot and AI who's actually going to be almost there as their guardian angel everywhere they go. But recognizing at the end of the day, the AI is an enabler, a force multiplier, but it's not them. And that's the future I see is, how AI is actually going to make us much better at what we do, but it's not going to replace us.
Make us a bit smarter.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Mark, it's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us on the Siren Investigates podcast.
Really enjoyed it. Great stuff. Thank you.